When you think of men's fashion in the medieval period, which of these pictures is closer to what you think of? This one or this one? Many people would say that it is the one on the left that they think of more. This is a stereotype perpetuated by various movies, such as Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. However, it turns out that, honestly, the picture directly above me is slightly more accurate historically. Note that neither is intending to be fully historically accurate, but that sort of bright color and the ruff and such is actually closer to what it really was. Today, I'm going to be talking about what men actually wore during the late medieval to early modern periods, because there's a lot of stereotypes about it that are generally just not accurate, and it's actually very interesting because for that period, men actually had more fashion than women. Men's outfits changed every couple decades during that period, whereas women's fashion stayed far more the same, with full skirts, and the main thing that changed was the neckline, and sometimes the fit. However, before I go any farther here, I'm going to give a couple of disclaimers. First off, I am not a professional historian or an expert in this field, just an interested student and hobbyist. I am attempting to use the work of professionals and primary sources as much as I can. Second, I will mispronounce certain words, it's an unfortunate habit of mine, so do not cite me. And to be clear here, I'm not cussing at any time. It's just certain words will sound fairly similar to cuss words. Then, all images I'm using here are published under a Creative Commons license or are public domain. I do not have the affiliation or endorsement with any of the creators of these images. Many of them are centuries dead. And a quick content warning, this video will include images of minor gore, mild sexual content, and religious content. These are all unavoidable in the study of the medieval period, especially in the study of images and costume, because of what the fashions actually were and because a major source is religious images, which include images of the crucifixion. And religion's also unavoidable because it was a major part of daily life in the medieval period. And finally, this video is mainly focused on Western Europe and the nobility. I will be mentioning certain other locales because they did influence the development of fashion. However, this video is aiming to talk about Western Europe. So to begin here, this is an image of the crucifixion painted by a Venetian Byzantine painter. And it shows the traditional dress which was common in Byzantium, which was the successor state of the Eastern Roman Empire. So a few things to note on this image. First, there is this garment called a palla, and sometimes it's given a different name for men, that most of the people in the image are wearing. This was used to drape around the body over top of the tunica, which was the long robe you can see here. Both those garments were gender-neutral to an extent, just the name changed depending on the gender. And right there is arrows pointing to the various styles of long tunics and the over-tunic, which the woman is wearing there. However, I'm focusing on men here, so there really wasn't much change from the Roman Empire here. The main difference is that higher-ranked men had their tunics get longer. Essentially, after the fall of the Roman Empire, the tunics gradually got to ankle length for men, whereas during the Roman Empire, it usually got to knee length at the longest, sometimes a little more. And this style is actually what influenced the early medieval period in Western Europe, as shown in this image. This image shows various fashion elements from the early medieval period and the high medieval period in Western Europe. As you can see, the king in this image, who is the 10th century Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, is very similar to the clothing worn by the Byzantines of high rank. He has the same sort of decoration on his robe, he has the same cloak, and the men around him are also dressed similarly. The priests especially. So, as you can see here, there wasn't a whole lot of change over the eras leading up to the period I'm going to be talking about. However, there is one more thing I need to get into before I can start talking about the actual fashions of the era, and that is the church. So during the medieval period, the church was a constant in daily life and influenced nearly every aspect of daily life. These two images show two monks or friars from the medieval period. The one on the left is an image of an Orthodox monk. That is the Eastern Church, which split after the Fourth Crusade, where essentially Western Europeans conquered Constantinople and installed their own emperor. Meanwhile, the other image is closer to the type of dress that was worn by friars and monks in the West. As you can see, he has a cowl, which is the hood that goes over the head, and he's wearing a loose-fitting robe tied at the waist. And this is what the church considered to be proper, modest dress for men. Now, this is actually something that's very important to note here because the church did not approve of any of these fashions. And this matters because all of the men in these images that I am talking about were Catholic, meaning that they subscribed to the church's authority and the church had a lot of moral sway over them. That's very important because if the church disapproves, then, well, you could get in trouble, potentially even excommunicated in some cases. So at this point, I'm going to go on to the actual fashions of men. So this is an image from a book from around the 14th to 15th centuries, which was written about good manners for noblemen. And these fashions are the fashions of the day for noblemen. Like, this is actually what noblemen would wear and considered to be the fashionable, the thing to wear. Whereas today, most men would say that's a clown's outfit. So I'm going to talk a bit about various parts of the clothing that are worn here, starting with the shoes. These shoes are called poulaines. They stick out past the toe by a couple of inches. And the longer the toe you had, the more fashionable and higher ranking you were. That's likely because they limited movement, and only those who were living lives of luxury and with no manual labor could wear them. And it's actually these poulaines which are notable in one other concept I'm going to introduce here called a sumptuary law. Sumptuary laws essentially restricted what people of different statuses could wear based on their status. This came up more and more as the merchant class gained power. And the merchant class at first tried to dress as luxuriously and fancy as they could, but these laws were passed in part to prevent them from doing that. Because, in fact, merchants became richer than a lot of nobles. And the other thing I'm going to mention on this photograph is the bright colors, because there is a certain stereotype that the Middle Ages were drab and dark colored. That's not accurate at all. In fact, the more vivid color you could wear, including, say, dark black, the more rich you were. You can see this in this photo. Of course, there's that yellow gold color, which is probably embroidery, but then there's also black, that bright scarlet red, and blue. Blue was more associated with women, but it was still worn by men. However, whereas these young gentlemen have this bright colored clothing, the lower classes also dyed their clothes. They just couldn't get the shades as vibrant as they had to wash it out, and they just couldn't afford enough dye. Because you did have to re-dye every so often, otherwise the colors fade. You can see that to this day. Now, continuing on other aspects of clothing, as that was a bit of a side note. There are these hose or tights. Different names are used, but essentially, they're far tighter fitting than anything men were wearing before. Before, they were wearing those long tunicas. And sometimes trousers. In fact, the Romans considered trousers unmanly, but this tightness was something that the church didn't approve of, along with the shoes, of course. But that's because it was considered immodest. And that is really the summary of what the church wanted. They wanted modesty. Then there's the doublet. This is also tighter fitting. Like in general, the theme in this transition from the early and high medieval period to the late medieval period is that the clothing got tighter and fitted the body more. So it's showing more of the body. That's really what the church was not a fan of. And that's even shown with this gown. The gown is basically the next development of what people were wearing before. But as you can see, it's still tighter fitting. It shows the waist more. It just is in general showing more. So this is what that same outfit transitioned to in the early modern period. Flipping back and forward, you can see some of the same elements of dress still being there. However, there is one that's pretty new, and that's the neck ruff. These were worn by various men in this era, and it was the gradual development from the neck of that doublet back here. As you can see, there's that stand-up collar on these doublets. Over time, in between these two pictures, they gradually added ruffles and generally made it bigger. And this was the end development of that change. The next piece I'm going to mention here is upper hose. These are these big baggy things that were added on top of the hose. Because in this earlier picture, the hose probably were actually one piece, but they tied at the waist. They weren't like the modern day stockings. If you get those, they are sewed together at the crotch. These are not. They were actually tied up on the leg. And later on, they added these big baggy things on top. Initially, it was just to cover the upper part of the leg a little more. Then it got bigger and bigger and bigger, until having huge versions of these was a status symbol. So that's why you're seeing it with these two men. Both of them are nobility, and they're trying to show off their wealth and their fashion. The other thing that's notable with nobility in this period is you can see like these various patterns in their clothing. Because like back here, there's embroidery on certain parts of it, or the whole gown here. But this version has it woven in a bit more. So basically, the nobility of this era gradually got more and more patterns on their clothing. And you can still see the vibrant colors. And this next thing I'm going to mention is a little awkward. I don't know how to explain it, but it's the codpiece. Initially, it was just a section sewn onto the front of the hose in the crotch area, you could say. It gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger, and just dangled there. I'll leave it to you to figure out what that was about initially. And then there's the development of jackets here. This was basically a farther development of the gown. And you can see it's open in the front, and it's not like the modern jacket, but it's similar in some ways. And the final thing to note on this picture is, well, there's the hat here, the Cavalier hat, which was used by the supporters of Charles I during the English Civil War, and some other associations. But the thing I really wanted to mention here is that he doesn't seem to be wearing shoes. That's because his shoes were actually sewn onto the bottom of his hose. That was the typical style after poulaines fell out of favor. And no, like I've been talking about how colors and styles and fashions were restricted by rank, by the force of law. Including like black only being for upper class people, red the same, or purple being only for the emperor. Now, there were people who actually did defy the social order. So this final slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about these groups. You may recognize these photographs. These men are fairly well known. That's really the best way to phrase it. They are somewhat famous in medieval history. I'll give you a hint. They were warriors who were known for their excellent skill in combat. And they actually went into combat wearing these clothes. They were called Landsknechts. They were a group of German mercenaries which completely upended those sumptuary laws and social orders. They came from all sorts of classes. A Landsknecht most likely came from someone who had a bit of money, but technically he could have been anyone by birth. And that's the kind of social mobility you don't normally see in medieval and early modern Europe, because who your dad was mattered more than anything else. However, some people, like these Landsknechts, did use fashion and such to project a sign of respectability that they didn't have. For instance, the Faithful Executioner references a Sir Franz Schmidt, who was an executioner because his dad was an executioner. However, up another generation or so, that ancestor was not an executioner. So Mr. Schmidt really wanted to not be an executioner. It was a terrible social status. So he intentionally dressed as a respectable gentleman, like these two men. And he also projected himself with respectability and avoided associating with men like the Landsknechts, because they were considered dishonorable. But these men basically upended social order. Now, the Landsknechts did that through force, but Mr. Schmidt did it more by just projecting himself as a respectable, pious man, because the stereotype of these disreputable men was essentially alcoholics and brawlers and just every nasty stereotype you can imagine. But at the same time, those men were not the respectable nobles that they dressed like. So this should give an idea of how social status was quasi-mutable, but really it was fairly set. To be clear, most men did not rise above the station of their father. Most of them held the same profession, lived in the same village. There were some who divided, however. If you have additional questions or comment on this, please comment it in below, and I will try to get to them as quickly as possible. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.